Hello everybody and welcome to Every Movie Ever. I'm your host Eric and this is the show where we're reviewing every movie ever made. Starting today with Dumpling. Dumpling is a new movie that debuted on Netflix that when I heard about it, I knew I had to watch it. Here's the deal. A young actress named Danielle McDonald stars as Willow Dean, a young woman, a larger girl whose mother is a former beauty pageant winner, the mother, played by Jennifer Aniston. Mom and daughter don't really get along, particularly after the death of Willow Dean's aunt slash Jennifer Aniston's sister, who Willow Dean had gotten along with much better. Her aunt was herself a bigger lady, and they had a special connection that largely, well, not, I don't know about largely, but often revolved around the music of Dolly Parton. Following the aunt's death, Willow Dean kind of decides to needle her mom a little bit by entering the teen pageant that the mom is running, which the mom is upset about because Willow Dean doesn't respect the pageant or whatever, isn't in it for the right reasons. And so the movie becomes about a number of things. It's about, a young woman. She's in high school. Young girl isn't appropriate. A young woman who is rebelling against her mother. It becomes about a young woman who is upending the standard beauty pageant world and conceptions of what is and isn't beautiful, especially as she ends up attracting other so-called high school misfits to her cause. So now there's 3 or 4 not stereotypical pageant girls in this pageant. But it's also a movie that's about this idea that, Jennifer Aniston is right to a certain degree, because as we watch the movie, we see the other misfit girls actually trying to participate in the pageant and embracing the ideals of what a pageant perhaps should be. But Willow Dean really is, for at least much of the movie, just in the pageant to stick it to her mom, which isn't really accomplishing anything. And it's about Willow Dean coming to terms with all of that, coming to terms with who she is, with who her mother is, with what their relationship is. There's also a romantic angle in this where a young man who is more traditionally attractive has a crush on Willow Dean, and she doesn't know how to handle that. And all of it is linked together by the music of Dolly Parton, both Parton's classic songs like Jolene and 1 or 2 originals that Parton wrote for the movie. It is easy, I think, to forget just how talented Dolly is, but to have her music used in this sort of avenue as opposed to the sort of more recent TV movies about Dolly's life that her music has been featured in really highlights the power of these songs, particularly for a girl who doesn't feel like she fits in. The other nice wrinkle to this movie is the involvement of a group of really fantastic drag queens who help the, again, so-called misfit gals to glam themselves up and, be ready for a big pageant affair. It's a movie that does in some ways feel perhaps a little cliche, but it works all those cliches perfectly and adds new wrinkles to all of them for a movie that is the definition of a feel-good movie, but does so in a real 21st century way. Dumpling, 4 stars. Up next for you, I have Ideal Home. This is a movie I had not heard about, but which came out in the last couple of years. It revolves, so here's the deal. It's a weekend afternoon. I'm looking for a movie to watch. I'm cruising the on-demand, seeing what's out there. I see this Ideal Home movie, and of course I'm going to watch it because the movie stars Paul Rudd, and we here at Every Movie Ever love Paul Rudd. And it also stars Steve Coogan, the British comic genius behind the various Alan Partridge series, who has maybe not broken through as much stateside. You might remember him. He's the director of the movie in Tropic Thunder. He has a number of roles like that size, but our friends across the pond know him for the comedic genius he is. In this movie, in Ideal Home, Coogan and Rudd play a gay couple who are, they're television producers, I believe. So Steve Coogan is like a TV cook, and Rudd is his TV producer, and then they're also long-term lovers who are very comfortable in their social situation. They're very, they're party throwers and socialites, and they have no interest in having children until a kid shows up on their doorstep who is Steve Coogan's grandson. Apparently Steve Coogan had a kid from a previous relationship, and the kid has been arrested for the umpteenth time, and so now the grandkid with nowhere else to go has shown up on Coogan and Rudd's doorstep. And so from what happens from there is your standard sort of feel-good comedy thing about how Coogan and Rudd learn to love and accept this child, which the child does not make easy. He is from a, rougher background, rougher circumstances, and Coogan, and in particular Rudd, who finds himself more comfortable with the kid more quickly, struggle to figure out how to raise this kid. That might not sound like a very funny movie, but the movie has a lot of great comic touches along with the emotionality of it. It is very well acted on all parts. A little bonus for those of you who've been watching the Murphy Brown reboot, Murphy's kid from that show is the father of Steve Coogan's grandchild. So that's something. Pretty good movie. 3.5 stars. All right, folks, it's action explosion time. This week on Action Explosion, we're going to talk about Blown Away. I have talked in the past on this show about movies like, for example, Action Jackson, which is an 80s action movie that I had somehow never seen, but yet is somehow the platonic ideal of the 80s action movie. I am always on the lookout for an underrated or undervalued action classic that I have never seen, because in a lot of ways those are my favorite kinds of movies. And to find one that is, completely new is a real thrill. And Blown Away seemed like it fit the bill. It is a late 80s, I think more early 90s action thriller about a bomb squad trying to stop, bomb terrorists. Jeff Bridges is the star of this one. I like Jeff Bridges. Tommy Lee Jones is the bad guy. Cast is shaping up great. Lloyd Bridges is also in this movie, and you also have a younger cop played by Forrest Whitaker. So on paper, this seems like it's going to be something, and the results were okay. To be honest with you, this is a very by-the-numbers thriller. It's not bad per se, it's just not super creative or super engrossing. There's nothing to really distinguish itself or make it memorable in that sort of action space, which is why I'm giving Blown Away 3 stars. Now it's time for Spaced Out. This week on Spaced Out, we are revisiting a Disney classic of my youth with Flight of the Navigator. This is the one where a little kid leaves home to play or whatever one night, wakes up the next morning, and it is like 10 years later, because as he comes to realize he had been abducted by a UFO with the voice of Pee Wee Herman. This is a movie I saw a fair amount of times as a kid, hadn't watched it in a long time. I was expecting, some mid-level Disney kids fare out of this. I mean, I remembered the story, and I remember being swept up in the spaceship parts of it as a kid, and certainly those parts are very cool. The spaceship is well designed, the interior is well designed, Pee-wee is fun, and there's a little Muppety alien thing that the kid gets to hang around with that, is also a fun time. What I hadn't focused on with this movie in the past, and the stuff I found myself connecting with more this time, were 2 things. One, the time dilation part of the plot is fascinating stuff, and a bigger science fiction idea than you would normally expect out of this sort of a Disney movie. What the heck do I mean by that? The idea being that when you get in a spaceship, if Einstein is to be believed, When you get in a spaceship and that spaceship approaches the speed of light, time for you in the spaceship travels more slowly than it does outside the spaceship. So, even though you might have only been in the spaceship for a couple of days, a couple of hours, the outside world has advanced 10 years. And to see a movie outside of like the original Planet of the Apes use that idea is interesting, especially with what they do with it. That idea that for this kid 10 years have passed. And that's the other thing I found so engrossing about the movie this time, was that emotional drama of a displaced child, both from the point of view of his parents, that that when he finally shows up and they're able to reconnect, that that relief mixed with the terror of your child having been missing for 10 years and they didn't think he'd ever come back and they were worried about happening to him, but also the terror and frustration and the confusion of the kid finding himself through no fault of his own in this place, in a world where his family's life has been chaotic for so long, where nothing is quite the way he remembered it to be, where his little brother is now like 5-6 years older than him. The confusing and frustrating and emotional place that the kid finds himself in is unusually well handled. So I guess what I'm saying is that Flight of the Navigator is a much deeper movie than I had thought it would be, and I give it a lot of credit for that. Flight of the Navigator, 3.5 stars. Now it's time for Calling All Horror Hounds. This week, Horror Hounds, we're talking about an Italian 80s horror classic that I had not previously seen, but I have heard of. We are talking about Demons, the first film in the Demons franchise, which is one of the most bizarre franchises from a point of view of how the sequels work and relate to each other of any franchise out there. I'm not going to get into it right now, but do yourself a favor, try looking online for stuff about how the Demons franchise work. It's pretty weird. I am going to recommend to you, I'll recommend to you the Colin's Crypt article on the subject over at Birth Movies Death. Birth Movies Death being one of my favorite websites, and Colin's Crypt being one of my favorite columns. But what does that have to do with Demons? What is Demons? What's going on? Demons is the story of some Italians with overdubbed American voices hanging around a really cool movie theater, having been invited to a special screening at that movie theater by a dude with a face that is 1/2 metal, because, that's not a red flag right there. And when you start watching the movie does something that starts making people turn into demons. And slowly but surely, our regular humans are whittled away as more and more of them turn into demons. This movie is insane. There is not, as Joe Bob Briggs would say, a ton of plot to get in the way of the story, and frankly, I liked it that way for this one. It's a gore fest. There's at every moment tons of crazy stuff going on that you don't really know what the story is, does not inhibit the movie at all. It looks fabulous. There are certain Italian horror films, I'm looking at you, Suspiria, that are just tremendous looking, and this movie is, while not in the same way as Suspiria, which is a very technicolor sort of horror flick, this is more of an 80s neon looking one, still absolutely fabulous. There's some really solid special effects here. We do leave the demon-haunted theater for a little bit in the movie to spend some time with some punks and some really weird scenes involving them trying to do cocaine that I could have done without. The ending, meanwhile, is absolutely awesome. The movie has a truly terrific nihilistic ending that I enjoyed very much, and is very much in fitting with the rest of this gonzo picture. Can't recommend it highly enough, but that said, it's still, that lack of a story does hold it back a little bit. Demons, 3.5 stars. Now it's time for a Hollywood classic. This week's Hollywood classic is The Magnificent Ambersons, the second film from the great Orson Welles, his follow-up to Citizen Kane, and his attempt to prove that he was not a one-trick pony is pretty successful. The story, such as it is, revolves around the Ambersons, an old money family who has a great deal of difficulty transitioning into the industrial age. The movie, as it exists, I'm sorry to say, is heavily butchered. The studio had lost a lot of confidence in Welles following the controversy around Citizen Kane, and they waited for him to travel to Brazil to pursue a project there to recut the movie. The version of Magnificent Ambersons that we have today is 40 minutes to an hour shorter than the cut Welles wanted to provide us with. As a result, especially that second half is very choppy. There are parts of the movies that are a bit boring, but it is a very intriguing movie still for what it might have been, and also for what is there. What is there is still supremely well shot and well acted. There are some truly amazing scenes in this. Agnes Moorehead, Endora from Bewitched, scored a Best Supporting Actress Oscar for this movie, where she plays a sort of a dowager aunt, and she really is terrific in it. If you haven't seen it, and I wouldn't be surprised, it's not a super widely seen classic. It is well worth your time, especially if you're a fan of Welles. This is, while the movie was taken away from him and considerably butchered, what you can see of his work here is still absolutely top-notch. The rating I'm going to give this movie is a combination of how good it still is, and also for the tantalizing possibilities that at least I see when watching it. And as such, I'm giving Magnificent Ambersons 4 stars. Now it's time for no one's favorite part of the show. This, my friends, is the worst of the week. This week's worst of the week is a sequel to a best of the bunch. We are talking about Pacific Rim Uprising. Now, I love Pacific Rim. Pacific Rim is a movie that I could put in and watch at any time. It's a favorite of mine and my wife's. We really love Pacific Rim. And we eagerly followed the development of a sequel. Pacific Rim hadn't done super well in the United States, but it was one of those movies that did great in China, enough so to really justify a sequel. Pacific Rim was directed by the great Guillermo del Toro, and so we were eager to see what Guillermo might do with a sequel, but Guillermo got seduced by other projects, as is his wont. Guillermo del Toro is possibly tied with Quentin Tarantino for the number of tantalizing movie ideas that he announces that just never quite happen. And Pacific Rim Uprising is one of those. It ended up following to, I want to say, and I may be wrong here, I apologize if I am, I believe it ended up being directed by TV director Stephen DeKnight, and the movie that exists out of this is roughy. We have virtually no returning characters from the original Pacific Rim. Instead, the movie focuses on John Boyega, who I do like John Boyega, playing the son of Idris Elba's character from the original Pacific Rim. He's been drafted into being a Jaeger pilot. Jaegers are the big robots, and to helping train the next generation of Jaeger pilots in a world where the monsters of the previous movie have been defeated. Along for the ride with Boyega is Scott Eastwood, the blandest man in Hollywood. And so here's the deal. The movie, it's terrible. It is terrible. Part of what's great about Pacific Rim is that visceral joy of giant robots fighting monsters. Unfortunately, in this movie, partially because of the resolution of the previous one, we don't have any monsters. Now, spoilers, monsters do show up late into this movie, having been coaxed here by a brainwashed Charlie Day in a plot twist that almost makes sense. So we got too few monsters here, but I do want to talk, and the other big strike for me is the only character from the previous movie that this one brings back is Mako, the Asian Jaeger pilot who had teamed up with Cade, I think his name was the character's name, with Charlie Hunnam in Pacific Rim. She's back and she's in charge of stuff now. And Mako, great character. Love Mako Mori, love her to death. This movie, of course, kills her off promptly. So, you know, that's another big strike. The good things that this movie has is that the movie opens with a young girl who has built her own Jaeger out of scrap, and some other Jaegers showing up to sort of bring her in, and then, you know, becomes the core character in the young people getting trained storyline. Kind of like that. The rest of it is absolute garbage, super frustrating. One of those movies that takes everything you loved about the original and just kind of tears it apart for no good reason. Pacific Rim Uprising, 2 stars. Now it's time for the best of the bunch. This week's best of the bunch is Crazy Rich Asians. Really like this movie. This movie is so much fun. And, you know, certainly there was a lot of press about this movie when it came out, about its all Asian cast. And it is great to finally see a movie like that. Because, you know, how did it take till 2018 to get an all-Asian romantic comedy, much less an all-Asian anything from an American studio, up on the screen? And this movie is terrific fun. It's a really fun romantic comedy. It falls in, I think, the subgenre of the aspirational romantic comedy, because this movie is about crazy rich Asians, right? The movie focuses on Constance Wu, who I have just loved for her work in Fresh Off the Boat, a pretty underrated sitcom for the last several years. She really shines here as the woman who realizes that her guy is super rich when they go to visit his family in Singapore. So you get lots of great production design, you get cool cars, you get cool settings, you get cool costumes, and you get that, you know, idea of not just the falling in love stuff, but the falling in love in front of a bunch of really expensive crap, which is a good time. The rest of the cast of this movie they're all-stars. They're absolute all-stars. You have the hilarious Awkwafina playing Constance Wu's best friend in Singapore. Really happy to have her here. Michelle Yeoh, the terrific Asian action film star, has entered a phase in her career where she is playing really like classy, you know, where she's playing really classy, wiser, elder sort of roles. And here she plays the patriarch of Constance Wu's boyfriend's family. And of course, she hates Constance Wu, and that works out great. Also, a really terrific turn here from Gemma Chan, a great up-and-coming actress who I first met on the show Robots, where she played one of them robots. Here she plays she has some sort of honorific title like the Princess of Singapore or something like that, where she's a well-off entrepreneur is not the right word, but she's a well-off mover and shaker and charitable person in Singapore society, but who is having trouble within her own marriage. She's terrific in this. This whole movie, I'm not going to talk about the plot a lot. The plot is there's not a lot of plot in this, but it works but it works. There's still a story. There's still a solid story here, holding everything together. And in a lot of ways, it's a story we've seen before, but everyone involved brings a lot of really fresh elements to it that I had so much fun watching. Crazy Rich Asians is also the rare movie that as soon as I finished seeing it, I was excited for a sequel. Since this is based on a book, and it did very well, we know that there will almost certainly be a sequel movie based on the sequel book, and I am really looking forward to it. Crazy Rich Asians, 4 stars. That is going to do it for this episode of Every Movie Ever. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next time as we keep trying to review every movie ever made. And don't forget to visit our website, northmetrotv.com/everymovieever. There, you can watch reviews of every movie we've ever covered here on the show, as well as complete episodes. That's northmetrotv.com/everymovieever.